I was a very underachieving student at school. I hated school because it was an interruption of me playing soccer, which I loved. I managed to get as far as matric by not doing one shred of work and not doing any homework. And so I'm absolutely the worst role model of what you should be at school. If you're just halfway smart, you can get through that system by not doing anything, you know? And so I didn't. I went to one of those agencies that do psychometric testing and career guidance and stuff. And for the first time in my life, someone shouted at me. There was this steely, grey-haired psychiatrist in a white coat, you know, and she said, "This is a joke. You are absolutely directionless. You've got no clue what you want to do, except you know you're going to university. But you think you might go and do dentistry, or you might be a teacher, or you might be an architect or a doctor, She said, actually, you can do any of those things, but the point is you've got to take control of your life and be responsible for yourself." It was the first time anyone had ever said this to me. It was like a...
Welcome back to another exclusive show. Today, it's one of those shows where you just sit down with a pen, listen carefully. Don't talk, don't do nothing. Just listen very carefully. It's going to be a very exclusive show because we have someone who's very brilliant. This person, oh my God, I can go on for days just giving you their bio. As a young man, I'd say this person is a G. He's an OG to the top. So the person we have today, he's the founder and director of GAPP Designs and Urban Designs. So this person has been a leader for more than 4 decades. He has done it all. I can't even explain to you what he has done. It's a whole list that can even end the entire show. Me just giving you his bio. So I'm just gonna let the man express himself and tell you who he is, where he's from, how did he go through the challenges that he went through, and how he became a legend that we respect today. How are you doing, sir? You good?
It's been great to be here. Thank you very much.
Ah, man, it's an honor to be in your presence. Please tell us, where were you born?
I was born in Florida on the west side of Johannesburg. And so I'm a Joburg boykie all my life, and I continue to be. But I've spent a great deal of my time living out of suitcases all over the place because I suppose like those people like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, you just had to go where the work was. Effectively, nothing's changed. We're still just a profession who are looking for rich patrons who can indulge our placemaking urges. And so I've always just seen my life as that, which is funny because I'm a very homebound person. I'm a bit like the guy who wrote Charlie Brown, you know, the Peanuts cartoon strip. So Charlie Brown was just a reflection of himself, but he always said, you know, I'll go anywhere as long as I can be home by noon.
Oh.
Yeah. And I've always been that kind of guy, but it seems that for all of that, I seem to have lived out of my comfort zone most of the time, for a lot of the time away from home. And but it's given me all that richness of working in this extraordinary thing of building cities, which is what I do. And it just occurred to me while you're making the intro that this year is actually my 50th year in this world of city building. In 1973, I took a job at the Johannesburg City Council in the town planning department. And I did that because I wanted to get a bursary to go to university and study. And so I first joined the council and worked for, I think, about 8 months or so before the next university year started, and I got a bursary in that time. And then I was with the Johannesburg City Council for about 10 years or so. Learned an enormous amount in that. And but one way or another, it strikes me it's now 2023, And that's 50 years on from then. And so I've been in this business for 50 years. It just feels like a lifetime.
Wow, man. And that was inspired by you trying to get a bursary.
Yeah, and I'd come upon this thing of urban design. Well, it was more town planning, I guess, quite by accident. And that's a long story. We shouldn't probably digress too much. But, you know, in the early 1970s, like most of us, I was a hippie and I was in my Mother Earth phase. And I lived sometimes in Joburg and sometimes on a commune out in what is now Northwest Province. But we were all like getting back to the land. You know, it was the time of Woodstock, etc. And so we were doing that. And I actually, and we subscribed to the principles of the Club of Rome, which was a very powerful, I suppose, research movement around the world back in the 60s and 70s. And the Club of Rome sort of enunciated principles like the limits of growth. You just can't keep growing indiscriminately. And so I subscribed to that in my Mother Earth way. And in all of that, I thought that cities would, in fact, I hated cities because I thought they were a kind of a global cancer that would just keep growing and growing and slowly spread and strangle the earth, and we would all suffocate in that. In fact, then quite by accident, I was a very underachieving student at school, you might say. I hated school because it was an interruption of me playing soccer, which I loved. But it was also just very boring and it just didn't engage with me. And so I managed to get as far as matric by not doing one shred of work and not doing any homework. And so I'm absolutely the worst role model of what you should be at school. But if you're just halfway smart, you can get through that system by not doing anything, you know. And so I didn't, but I played soccer. And then, unfortunately, in matric, it tripped me all up. I found you can't just busk your way through these things like science and maths and things which I hadn't done any work for. And so, basically, I got a school leaving, but I didn't get a university education matric initially. And so I was quite surprised by that because, you know, I always thought I would go to university. I didn't know what I would do, but I would go to university. So I decided to go back and rewrite maths and science as a supplementary, and I managed to then get what qualified as a university entrance exam result. Then, because I was a conscientious objector and I declined to go to the military. I went instead into the fire department of Johannesburg, and so I trained as a fireman, got a diploma as a fireman. Yeah, for a whole year I was a fireman, and let me tell you, it was great. Learned a hell of a lot. I grew up very quickly. You know, 17-year-old in that world is quite something. So, grew up fast, and on one of my days off, because we worked on one day 24 hours, and then we were off for 24 hours. I went to one of those agencies that do psychometric testing and career guidance and stuff. And for the first time in my life, someone shouted at me. There was this steely, grey-haired psychiatrist in a white coat, you know, who at the end of the day pulled me in for my final set, because we had been doing these tests all day, right through for 12 or 13 hours or something. Then you get this interview. And she said, "This is a joke. You are absolutely directionless. You've got no clue what you want to do, except you know you're going to university. But you think you might go and do dentistry, or you might be a teacher, or you might be an architect or a doctor, She said, actually, you can do any of those things. But the point is, you've got to take control of your life and be responsible for yourself." It was the first time anyone had ever said this to me. It was like and she said, "So I have to tell you that what I've seen in your stuff today, yes, you have design interests that would probably intersect with architecture, but you show a very powerful social need to be really doing an applied social science. And so you might want to think of town planning. So I've never heard of this. In fact, it never dawned on me how cities even happened or what made them up or anything else. And it was almost like a road to Damascus experience of going home with the scales fallen off my eyes, and I'm looking at things around me and saying, how did that happen? Where did that come from? And that totally chance thing of this interview with that woman who I owe a whole 50 years of career to now, who screamed at me, was fantastic. It gave me a whole new thing. And she said, but I'll tell you what, you're not going to get into anything at university with your matric results, even though I'd done maths and science over. So on my days off, I used to study then to do history and geography as well. And I upped those. And so I got enough of a matric after effectively 3 tries at it to just squeak into university. And then at university, it was just like, I never looked back. It was like doing something that fascinated me for the first time, that everything, and I just wanted to soak up information. I wanted to experience it all. And even though I'm not a great reader, I started reading on stuff. And so all of this is a very long way of saying, as I got to understand the city, I understood that it wasn't this monster I'd painted of it, that it was going to become a cancer that enveloped the world. Cities are in fact incredibly efficient things. You can take vast numbers of people and put them on a very, very small footprint on the earth. And you can do a lot of stuff in terms of creating economies, of housing people, of giving people dignity, access to culture, and of course those incredible things that happen with cities in the social dynamic of crossover, people learning from each other and living effectively a common life, even though from these very, very different kind of places. And so more than that, what I started to realize, and it's interesting, if you look at the population projections that were being done in the early 70s, and we think we've got a lot of people, and absolutely, we've got way too many people on the planet, but you can't, you be the one who goes and tells them they've got to leave while you stay, okay? So that's what we've got. And as weirdly, there was a radio thing just last week that said, India's population is going to be bigger than China's population. And I'm thinking, yes, sort of like in 2030 maybe. She said, at the end of next week. So apparently at the end of this week, I think it is, India officially outstrips China as a population. Right? So yeah, we got we've gone, I think we're up into the 7 and 8 billion people on the planet. It's too much, but let me tell you what was being projected in the 70s was worse than that. It was more than that. And what has plateaued out our population growth over this 50 years that I've been around is not war or pestilence or plague or HIV, AIDS, or any of those things that a lot of people like to point to. It's actually because people have urbanized to a point where in the 1990s was the first time the world crossed over from being a rural population to an urban population. More people in the 90s were now 50-50. That 50-50 thing was tilted in the 90s. We became urban predominantly. As you know now, we're talking about by 2050, 2070, 70 to 80% of the world's population is going to be living in cities. So with all of this, you say, well, that sounds like this cancer thing. Yes. But if you look at it and you say, there's Britain as an island, it's 95% urbanized, and yet 85% of its land mass is still officially designated as rural. So that's incredibly efficient. If you look at the States, it's about 80% urbanized, but like 90% of it is still effectively countryside or rural. So what it's saying is that we take vast numbers of people, put them on small footprints and make them enormously productive to drive all these other things. But fascinatingly, what also happens is the whole economic principle changes that drives economies. So in a rural society, the factor of population are people who can work the land, people who can pick up things, can herd, can do all of those things, effectively do the heavy lifting that goes with farming. And particularly in non-mechanized countries, that means a hell of a lot of people need to be doing that work. And so it's entirely natural that you'll have many, many children. And of course, on top of that, all in those marginalized kind of rural areas where there's only trickle-down health facilities, you've got a hell of a high attrition rate of child mortality. So you have to breed at real scale to have enough to support the economy, so to speak, which is this rural economy, which when you look at it like that, it's a bottom-up economy. It's people working here, and it's a very flat kind of pyramid of people. Okay? If you come into a city, the factor of production is knowledge, education. It's an incredibly expensive resource. And so what you're going to do, you're going to have many fewer of the little buggers that, because you're going to need, I mean, the number is not a precise one, but in the order of magnitudes, if you're going to take somebody and make them fit for purpose in this kind of urban economy, that's just 2 million rand for everything that goes with education, with ballet, with soccer, with all of the things kids do at school and stuff, okay, and nurturing a child. And that's 2 million rand. Not obviously not everyone gets that, but the point is it's an incredibly valuable but very expensive factor of production. So what are you going to do? You're going to have fewer children. And what we've seen in that plateauing of the population is effectively the unseen effect of an economic shift into the cities and people having fewer children. And that's why the population hasn't grown as we anticipated. And so if we take in a view on this, and of course you see places like China with aging population now where they, even though they had this huge population, that population's slightly shrunk. So India hasn't overtaken it simply by producing more people. China has actually reduced its production of people. Okay? But then you look at, the whole of Europe is staring at this problem of where the young people are going to support all these old people who carry on living because they got better health and stuff now. So all these things are very uneven, and we're in a very exciting time because we don't know where it's all going. And you've seen all those riots and things in France because of wanting to make you retire earlier, but then people, or they want you to carry on working longer because you can't just go on pension when you're 60 kind of thing, because who's going to support the economy? So all of these things but they're fascinating urban issues, really, although they impinge on global issues and effectively have as much relevance to rural society as well. So the city thing, I thought I was just getting involved in a kind of a little bit of an affair, but it turned out to be a full-on marriage, and my mistress is the city, and I've just loved the growth path in that. So it's an entirely unintended consequence of where I've ended up, but as I got into it, it's just taken me to the most extraordinary things and places and excitement.
So which is the most extraordinary place that faith has taken you?
I would like to keep that in the South African context, I guess, because it's my world. It would be easy to say, and then by extension, I might look into Africa, but there's no question that when you go and travel internationally and you see extraordinary cities, and particularly those cities that come with something that we don't have to the same extent, this idea of time, those European cities. You go to the Heidelberg University has been there for 800 years, just the university, let alone the city. The university is over 800 years old. Like Wits celebrated its centenary a little while ago. So that's mind-boggling. And to see the layers of the city and the time that they've moved through and the processes they've gone through and the growth and, of course, the bad times, the wars, all of that sort of thing. You can see the kind of medievalism in our society now of very few people with a lot in a sea of vast numbers of people with very little. And the net result is we in a kind of a neo-medieval thing where you put up walls around your city to try and keep people out, okay? And thankfully, through history, we see that those walls don't necessarily come down, but the gates open and they never close again, etc. And the city gets taken over by these people who come to the city because what cities do, if they're left alone to do it properly and organically, they have this extraordinary capacity to take poor people and turn them into something worthwhile. And there's nothing nice to be said about urban poverty, other than I've got to say that it beats the hell out of rural poverty. You know, if you really want to see languishing poverty in rural areas, etc., it's desperate. In urban areas, you have this other thing of being able to develop urban community, where you lean on one another and you help. As you have something to give, you can give. As you need something, somebody can give to you. That's an extraordinary thing, and we've seen that throughout history in cities, and particularly, I suppose, those immigrant populations that came in the 1930s into the United States at scale after the First World War and before the Second World War. We took tens of millions of people coming in a concentrated time, and the way they were able to make it in those cities was to organize in community. So you'd get very much in Boston, there's still a street with, I think, about 70 Italian restaurants on it, kind of thing, you know, but that's how you organize. And so urban community gives you that. And I suppose for me, this idea of city and community are inextricably linked. I see no point in building cities if I'm not trying to build communities. Community seems to me to be the basis of everything because it's the social glue that ties everything together. It is the coping mechanism, particularly in poverty. And when we get too smart and too affluent and too big for our boots, we forget our localness. Because now I'm actually a citizen of the world. I live in cyberspace. I connect with whatever community I like. That's great. But we also totally forget how place-bound we are. You know, and I've always said this, that, you know, for all our intelligence now and our extraordinary access to everything, to live this international world, we are still actually no more sophisticated than a caveman who stands up every morning and he stretches and he like picks up his club and he walks out to go and club something to death because he needs to feed himself, okay? So nowadays, the club is actually a little plastic card and you go into a mostly my wife goes and clubs things to death in the supermarket with my card, okay, with her card. So that's the modern, because in the end, it doesn't matter how clever we become in cyberspace. We're still just these human people who have physical needs, who are place-bound, whose life happens in space, form, shape, shelter, environment. And mostly we have to consume. So I used to think we lived in cities because we liked each other. Actually, we don't. We should like each other, and many people do. But mostly we live in cities because it's a cooperative thing that you can consume far more efficiently. If you on your own somewhere in the far end of the Karoo and your shoelace breaks, you're at the end of a very long, inadequate supply chain. Right? When you live in a port city and the stuff's coming from all over the world, it comes straight onto your table, so to speak. The city becomes a smorgasbord of consumables. And if you then got cities at scale that aren't at ports, but they become inland ports in their own right, like at Johannesburg, then that's what happens as well. So cities exist because we're still remarkably human and physical and space-bound. And that's why, for all the extraordinariness that I've seen in 50 years of what the digital world has done, and in the 60s, there was a great book by a guy called Melvin Webber called The Placeless City, I think it was, or the Non-Place Urban Realm, which posited, and you can imagine in the 60s, we still didn't even have a desktop. We were still, our computers were no longer taking up whole buildings, but they were taking up rooms, But we didn't even have. He said cities will probably decline because we won't need them anymore. We'll move into a placeless world, or a place less bound by space. And of course, he's been partially right, and we've seen how particularly affluent people can move and get away from things and live in cyberspace, etc. But they do that at the peril of losing this ability to have access to market and the physicalities that go with that. And so even though there's always been this idea of the non-place urban realm that goes with computers, which has now culminated, and it hasn't culminated, it's reached, but it's still going to go beyond the internet and this extraordinary world of excitement that we're going into. We still have cities, and cities will apparently continue to grow because of this very physical need that we have to consume. And so all of that kind of colors a world, and the pieces that are so difficult about that, I suppose, is always this thing of the relative deprivation of a few with a lot and many, many more with very little. And we had hoped back in the post-war period and through into the 60s and into the 70s, we really saw pushback against that, where big agencies were starting to see, how do you democratize? How do you take things on? How do you expand an economy? How do you make economies inclusionary? We saw an enormous, and then just weirdly, when communism failed, was finally defeated, so to speak, with the collapse of the USSR, it then just became a one-horse race. It was then just capitalism. It had always been capitalism and communism, and in a sense, they kind of like tempered each other. And suddenly, with this communism gone, this capitalism thing just became, in my view, unbridled greed. And it was just everybody in there to take whatever the hell they could. And it's what's led, in my view, again, to the kind of Trumpism and all of that stuff, of just people accumulating obscene wealth and more than ever holding that wealth in fewer hands. And that's been an extraordinary thing for me to see in my last 10 to 15 years, is to see how quickly those things that we always thought were almost like so robust, like democracy. How can democracy how can it fail? Because it's so much driven about this basic idea of an individual's need for their own identity and self-worth and freedom. It's in a sense, the most authentic, self-perpetuating kind of thing you would imagine. Except if there's somebody with greed as an agenda, then they'll start stripping out that and telling you why you can't be this, that, or the next thing. And so that's a sadness for me, and I think we see it heavily in South Africa again as well. It's a sad thing.
Hectic. With what you're saying, do you think the metaverse has a chance of outshining cities, or cities will always be there and the metaverse will also exist?
Yeah, the two should complement. Okay, we should get better cities because of the metaverse.
Why? Why are you saying that?
Because we can over-romanticize cities, as I do, because I love them. But man, they are hard work, and they are not equal, and they're very hard to run and maintain. And they're also, of course, very resource intensive as well. And again, they're also the place where we create the biggest carbon footprint. Yes. But it has this advantage that if we're going to attack making, if we want to reduce our carbon footprint to a toe print, the place to do it is in cities. And that's what smart cities are. It's how do we make cities sustainable? And sustainability and smartness for me has nothing to do with throwing tech at a city. If having a street light giving you, as you walk past it, it says, watch it, your shoelace is undone, you might trip, and that's not a smart city. Smart cities can do that, but all that is, that's just tech taken to another level kind of thing. The big danger of that tech thing is this idea of increasing the digital divide between those who can participate and those who can't. You don't do that on purpose, but it's an unintended consequence, obviously, that cities that move more and more into this thing, and it was, of course, a profoundly important discussion in the Lanseria Smart City thing, in the planning of that, which was a 9-month program in 2020. We were vastly aware of this fact that we were here not to just make a high-tech city, but to make a sustainable urbanism. And that we would use, of course, the tech and the big data and all that stuff to underpin a more efficient and better city. But fundamentally, the dimensions of sustainability, of what takes a city forward, makes them future-proof, all of those things. There are many, many dimensions to that, and smartness is one of them. The green agenda is another. It's only a part of it. Of course, we need to be ecologically principled. We have to find reconciliation with a planet that supports us. We can't go on beating it to death the way we are. All of that green agenda is vastly important. But equally, I'd say to you, if you can't make an economy that's inclusionary for all, you haven't even got to the first base of trying to make a sustainable city. All you're doing is you're sitting on a powder keg, because in the end, cities can't tolerate that imbalance and that inequality. Yeah? So if you can't get a city that's socially inclusive and economically inclusive and culturally inclusive, you're just effectively setting up the skittles to be knocked down. You know, and of course, sadly, we see that. The Toxteth riots in Brixton, the New York riots back in the 60s, the Watts riots in Los Angeles in the 60s. These are just societies that are so frustrated. And I think you could even say the same thing about what we saw with the looting in Etegrini 18 months, 2 years ago. There's an inherent frustration that sits underneath all of this, and it doesn't take much to bring it to the surface. And so if you can't get that inclusion and really understand city purpose as being a cooperative act in community in the way that everybody is included, then you haven't got even the first stepping stones towards sustainability, in my view. So the Lanseria Smart City was posited on much, much more than simply this facile idea of what is a smart city. I'm not overly interested in those smart cities because, you know, if you look at Singapore, of course, if you look at Dubai, yes, yeah, Singapore's a city. I don't like Dubai. It's not a city, really. It's just like a fabrication, but it's smart, terribly smart. So, you know, I think it's important when we talk about cities' future sustainability and those things, we've got to fully understand it in a socio-economic, inclusionary understanding of what city purpose is. Because here's the thing that I've taken with me. There was a wonderful TV series when I was but a kid with a dream. But it was after we got TV, which was only in the 70s, but it would have been the late 70s maybe. There was a BBC series called The Ascent of Man by Professor Jacob Bronowski. And as these things go, it was then dressed up as a book after the TV series. But it was this thing that understood civilization as manifested through cities, etc. And Jacob Bronowski said that cities are humanity's greatest contributions to the world in cooperative community. Those are, you know, and that has always been my touchstone. So if I'm not doing it as a community, if I'm not helping to engender, I can't create a community, no one can. There are lots of things you can do that will almost kill a community if you do the wrong things. But you can only try and do the right things that might lead to a community. So my life has always just been, I suppose, that search for trying to make community or trying to enable community and to give dignity and power to those people to believe. And that's why this idea of owning the public environment of a city, to have full access to the public dimensions of cities, for me is fundamental to what we do as well. And so, of course, cities hugely are built either by power elites or rich patrons or markets, which is pretty much rich patrons, I suppose. But and we desperately need those people who build and commit capital to these buildings, etc. But if all it's done is created privatized pieces that actually turn their back on the wider public dimension of the cities, then we're achieving, I think, very little, and we're achieving only artificial things. And if you can't make that work for many more people, and of course, apartheid. Can you remember that thing, apartheid? Someone thought it was a good idea once. Yes. That you could actually stop people coming to cities. We'll put them in homelands out there, these fabled kind of worlds, And of course, you then have laws that prevent people coming into the city. Insane. You can't do that for more than, I think apartheid was heroic in doing it for as long as it did. And of course, in the process, it took all the resources and bankrupted the country anyway. But anyway, that's beside the point. You can't stop cities becoming these things. Okay, and it's a great hypothesis, I suppose, that no city in history had its public domain or its public environment delivered democratically. There's never a big bunch of people who sat around and said, okay, let's just discuss this now and we'll vote and we'll say we'll have parks and we'll have roads and it never happened like that. Of course, it was far more organic, but it was effectively, all those things were delivered unwittingly by rich patrons and power elites. And if I cite some examples, the St. Mark's Square in Venice, which is probably one of the most extraordinary urban spaces. It's an iconic urban space. That, historically, sitting right next door to what was then the busiest port in the world, where Italy was trading with the Far East, and this whole renaissance of trade was going on. Right next to that was an orchard of fruit trees that belonged to the Doge. The Doge was the magistrate of the city, effectively the most powerful guy. Okay? And he had a palace right next to this port, and that was where he grew fruit. And after a while, people come along and they say, I don't remember voting for you as Doge, but what the hell are you doing with fruit trees right next to this thing where we can seriously do trade and economy? And so in the end, it's a losing battle. Of course, he would have held on for as long as he could, but that piece of land is why it had created enough of a space for somebody, in effect, for the democratization of the city to come and take back something and make something useful out of it. Hyde Park in London, if you know anything about Dickensian London with the Industrial Revolution, what an awful, awful world of poverty and squalor, etc. Okay? All these people coming in from the rural areas into this new, seething, smoky, belching fumes kind of world of industrialism. Okay. And creating an extraordinary economy, but the worst kind of living conditions. So who was the inspired genius who said, one day this city's going to need a Hyde Park? So here's Hyde Park, guys. Well, no, it wasn't like that either. Hyde Park, or what is now Hyde Park, one of the most extraordinary world parks as well, that was the king's hunting ground. And again, after a while, people are saying, geez, we're living in all this squalor, and this guy's got hunting grounds here. And I also don't remember voting for him. Okay, and after a while, the city takes back. And there, if you look at the power elites, that's what the Brandenburg Gate, Red Square, all these places where the power elites created spaces to strut their stuff of power. Even time has to come when even the Vatican loses power on St. Peter's Square and all of that, and which is only there to make you feel very small and dependent on this big institution. I think that's my take. It's a cynical one, but I think it's true. But the point is, these things are delivered unwittingly. Now, the stuff that I've been lucky to work on has been to say, how do we do that consciously as an upfront piece and design that public environment first, such that we create the building blocks that all these other people will come and invest their capital into and create an architecture that is supportive of this public environment. And in all of that, and this, this is just the world I subscribe to. Some of it, I hope I've added my thinking to, but certainly it's not my thinking. It's a whole movement of how do you create cities that become responsive in their architecture to a public environment. In my view, the Mhlanga Ridge Town Centre that I designed with GAPP, that 65% of the security of that town is because we insist that buildings have to face outward onto the street and people on the street need to be able to look into buildings. And that's why we don't board things up with advertising and things like that. It's got to be this responsive architecture, because it's that subliminal thing of looking out that creates a threshold intolerance for people who are looking there to boost a car or whatever, or take your hubcaps or whatever. Right? And in that town centre, I can put money on it that if and when we do lose a car, it's because it's outside a place that has pasted itself up with adverts, for example, and you can't see in and out. So this interactive in and out, it's what in architectural literature is referred to as defensible space. That the street becomes an extension of my life, and I look after it. And in fact, I've got a car parked at curbside, and in a city, apart from your apartment, that car is probably one of the biggest investments you're going to be making in your life. You're going to watch it. So all of these things become, and it's why these privatized cities that have introverted buildings around their own little empires of atria, and of course shopping centers do that as well, is we junk the public environment and we're not responsive to it. And effectively we try and outshout people with our glitzy stuff, but we're not using public manners. We've lost public manners in city building. So my take, and I've been very lucky to work on really important things, and we'll come back to the thing of GAPP and everything in a moment. But I'm lucky enough to say that I was involved right from the beginning in the design team that did the Victoria and Alfred Waterfront. Back in 1988, we started with that. About that same time, we were doing what is now Mandela Square. At that time was called Sandton Square. And not because of making the space, but because of this thing of how do you use that investment into what was then Sandton Square to generate all this other response. So, and to put this, I suppose, into property terms, everything I look to do is about this thing of stimulus response. How do you stimulate something to get a response, a development response? But then in turn, of course, as you get a development response, that in turn becomes a knock-on stimulus to, and this idea of how you track and mold and work with the organic energies of stimulus and response is a fascinating design studio, and that's how I conceive it. So the V&A Mandela Square, Bank City for First National Bank in the city centre, as much as it's a very classical architecture, etc., but it's one of the few big complexes. It takes 5 city blocks that actually interacts on every single ground level with its street and creates a new public space, which at the moment, of course, is very pinstriped and sort of constipated because it's a corporate thing. Time will come, it'll just be another St. Mark's Square. You know, it'll become an urban living room. It'll become one of the great spaces, and that's how. And so I've always just looked at how can we create space in such a way that in the end, the actors on the stage of life, which are the citizens of a town or a city, they become the people who endow things with meaning. They're the people who use things. We can't micromanage and design that stuff, and we shouldn't. And it does mean that you take the rough with the smooth. Quite often you design a pristine space, and the next thing is it's, it's been used for all kinds of things that you really wouldn't want your daughter to see. But what we also see in cities throughout the world through history is spaces change and change and change. Somehow the space remains, but they change. Just as the orchard became this extraordinary trading square, the space kind of remains, but it changes life cycle all the time, and it's always doing something. I suppose that's reflective of the need of the community at the time, and it's not always pretty, but it's authentic, I think. Yeah.
With what you said, how did you guys come to work on the waterfront project?
Okay, so right here in Newtown was how we came to do that. We, Newtown has always been just such a fascinating piece of old industrial archaeology in Joburg, because it had the cooling towers, it had the whole power station, it had the market, the potato sheds, all of those things. And every year, not one year went by without there being a great architectural thesis in Wits University about what you should do with what was just crumbling, decaying stuff. And there were always these great theses. And so in 1986, the city launched a competition for ideas, not even a complete design, just an ideas competition for what to do with Newtown and how to upgrade it, etc. And so we decided, look, the issue isn't are there good ideas for Newtown? The real question is, why do good ideas die? Why doesn't any of this good stuff that we see being suggested ever happen? And it's because it's unenabled. So we decided we were going to go into this thing with both barrels blazing. And so it was quite funny, because the prize for this competition was, back in 1986, was 7,500 rand, okay. Which even in those days wasn't a great piece of money. But we spent 60,000 rand on putting in our design competition, if you put all our work into it. And so that's not good business. But here's the thing. What we didn't realize was that the main adjudicator, if you call it the chairperson of the adjudicating committee, who then looked at all these competitions, was a guy called Dave Jack, who was an urbanist and architect from Cape Town. In those days, he was in the city of Cape Town. And unbeknown to us, he was right on the beginnings of making this transition into this new fledgling thing called the Victoria and Alfred waterfront. Okay. So he literally said, this entry is as good as a project you can put on the ground right now. You can start building and you're doing the right thing, kind of thing. He was full of praise for it. And then about 6 months or a year later, we got a call from him saying, there's this V&A waterfront now, and we want you to lead that team. And so did our 60,000 rand pay back? It certainly did, yeah, okay. And we seriously did that with no agenda. We didn't know that at all. But, and what that led to then is we were asked to find a like-minded firm in Cape Town that we could work with. And we found a great company called, so we were Gallagher, Aspo's Poplack Senior in Johannesburg. That was GAPP's. And down there in Cape Town, and it's our 30th anniversary of this new venture now, okay, this year. We met up with these guys who were Prinsloo, Parker, Flint, Elliot, Gould, Van der Heever, like a really unmanageable. So we worked together in association to begin with. It was called GPA, Gallagher Prinsloo Associates. And so we did all our work effectively in association, but we weren't a single firm. And then after 4 or 5 years, in 1993, we said, well, we've been living together for 4 or 5 years now, why don't we get married? And so that's what we did. And we took the GA from Gallagher Aspo's and the PP from Prinsloo Park and put them together, and it became GAPP, because we didn't want to lose that GAPP's identity that we were quite well known for from an urban design point of view. And so the market they hardly even saw that there was this new entity called GAPP. But so that's the baby that I was one of the founding partners of. I had joined GAPP's from my time at the City Council back in 1983. Okay, so that's 40 years ago. Huh? Yeah. And then what you didn't say in your introduction was I retired from GAPP about 2 years ago. And the idea never was to stop working. It was just to not be involved in a big practice anymore, but to focus on a much smaller, focused kind of, they're big projects, but it's a focused portfolio that I can just deal with. And I work in teams with lots of other people. But it's become actually one of my most fulfilling times of my life now, is this new work in my own right kind of thing. We still have fantastic relationships and work with GAPP, and they always are my DNA, and you know, it's my soul. But I'm on my own now. But I'm just loving what I'm involved in now, and just still able to do extraordinary stuff. You know, I always joke and say, I've got to be brutally honest with myself. I've probably only got another 40 years left in this business. They better be good ones. You know, I'm not going to be wasting my time. And I don't work on risk, and I don't do all that other kind of abuse that architects and urban designers get. I get paid to do what I'm doing, and I'm enjoying that immensely. And feeling, I hope, as though I'm still making a contribution to the world. You know, I'm disappointed that we haven't even scratched the surface of transforming the apartheid city, and that's simply because we haven't had the political will, in my view, to take on the very tough decisions that you've got to do, and that of course comes out of just the real politics of, you know, if you're going to deliver housing, people are going to deliver it however they can, wherever they can. And sadly, very largely it gets delivered by sprawling the city. And you just keep, whereas sprawling the city is the antithesis of what we should be doing. If we want to become a competitive world city, you better start folding the city in on itself and consolidating it and turning it into a powerhouse. We do the opposite still. Unfortunately, we still just sprawl and sprawl and sprawl. And that's all documented. In fact, all the policies say we will not sprawl, but we do. Because there's just not the political will. It's because they're hard decisions. You've got to say no to things, you know. You've got to have leadership. You've got to have determination. But unfortunately, there's too little understanding of this property world that we're talking about, because that's effectively what we are. You know, as much as I've spoken really about cities, all I'm saying is that for 50 years I've been in the property industry, because the property industry is what builds cities, okay? Together with leadership and public involvement. I'm a huge believer in public planning. I went into private practice, in a sense, almost feeling just too frustrated in public planning because I couldn't achieve anything in public planning. You know, it was just too wishy-washy. So I went into private, but by nature, I'm a huge believer and protagonist for publicly led planning. But we just don't lead. We have policies, we've got documents, we've got all the right words, but we're not doing the stuff, you know. And the net result is we've still got huge populations languishing out on the periphery of cities, having to spend, the people least able to commute are the people who have to commute the most. You know, and in a way, that's what drove the Lanseria. Why I was prepared to buy into the Lanseria project was because, you know, people say, who's going to live in that new smart city? I say, they're already living there. That's Diepsloot, it's Cosmo City, it's Zevenfontein. It's all these people who are languishing out on the edge of a city. They've got one extraordinary thing there, this driver of a great airport, really well-run private airport. How do you turn that into, and how do you say, stop throwing housing at this place and start throwing economic activity and economic infrastructure into this place. And that becomes the beginning, because that's what will make life worthwhile, dignified, and sensible for all those people who already live there. That's the smart city for me. We wait to see.
So how did you get involved in the Lanseria project in this genesis?
It was a tender put out by province.
Okay.
I think they put it out probably in about 2018, and we put in a tender. And it had to be a huge team, I mean, because it had to be engineers, environmentalists, agricultural economists, ordinary urban economists. It was a vast team. And I was the leader of that team, okay? And we put in this tender, and we heard nothing. In fact, they'd totally forgotten about it. And then in March of 2020, like it's more than 2 years later, phone call. And you've got to start now, because it's very important and urgent, and so here we go, right? So we had like 3 days of quite intensive briefing because this thing straddled the office of the Premier in Gauteng with the presidency at a national level. So it was a seriously important, interesting piece of dynamic. And it had to bring 4 local authorities along with it, because planning can only be done by local authorities in terms of the constitution. So all of these people had to agree on what this bigger thing was that we were working on, because we were working across 4 municipal districts. And so it was always going to be kind of difficult, okay? It got more difficult on the 3rd day because we had COVID and a lockdown, bang, and we were locked down. And from absolutely a cold standing start, we had to start working online at a level that we've never worked at before. And we did 9 months, it was a 9-month contract. It had to be delivered in that December of that same year. This was in March. And we did it in 9 months. There were, I think, half the team, my team that I was leading, I hadn't even met. Still haven't in many cases, because we only met online and we were only working online. You know? And in all of that, we had to run this huge stakeholder program of every interest group signed up, and we had to have these huge webinars and things to take them through our thinking and our planning through a staged process. You don't just do a plan and drop it there. You say, this is our understanding of the issues. This is our understanding. This is our take. And how do we take in the environmental lobby? How do we take in these lobbies, those lobbies, etc., and work with that? Having to have huge numbers of one-on-ones as side things online. It was a hell of a project, but it was a hell of a team. It was a great piece of work. It really was. I'm enormously proud of that team. We did extraordinary things, and it's a great plan. I'm just not sure that it's, because it comes to this next piece about the property industry.
Yes.
And you can almost, if I was to give one piece of advice and leave the planet, it would be to say nothing great was ever achieved in the property industry, without saying the rest of the world or anything else, just the property industry. Nothing was ever achieved by doing it part-time. Okay? So this Newtown project, for example, never took off, even though it was the foundations of what happened at the V&A. Okay? It didn't take off because they thought, oh, there's an engineer in the engineers department there. We can give it to him as a project. And the net result is, here's a guy who's trying to get through his day. He's trying to do his normal job, and now he's been handed this as well. Turns out that in the end, you're trying to do this whole thing for the city, sort of somewhere between orange juice and cereal in the morning at breakfast, kind of. You're going to give it some thought, and then you're giving it like this nanosecond of thought. You cannot do that. And by contrast, if you look at what the V&A became, they never just handed it to some engineer in Transnet and said, this is your project because this is Transnet land. And so you think about this between orange juice and cereal every day. They created this whole new entity, and that entity has done nothing other than 24/7, never sleeping, never stopped thinking, never doing. They built this extraordinary thing, and they're still only half built out, incidentally. There's a lot more to come there. Okay. It's extraordinary, but it just shows the need for determined, focused project management and direction into this. And on the Lanseria Smart City, one of the very important recommendations is you've got to set up this particular agency. It's got to be an agency that represents all 4 of the local authorities, because otherwise you're imposing something on them. So you've got to take people out of the Joburg Development Agency, the Khalied City Development Agency, Chinese Development Agency, and out of Maribé, across in Northwest Province, which is also one of the local authorities. You've got to say, you guys might well get paid by and report back to your various structures, but you sit on this project 24/7 and you never sleep, and you do that full time. That's how projects get done, and that's how Umhlanga Ridge happened. That's how all these things, and that's why private enterprise is good at what it does, because there's real money involved. And so if you're going to commit capital, you better be damn sure that it runs straight away, and that you're not wasting anything. And so that would be the biggest thing for me, is this idea of hands-on involvement. And I've just been lucky that many of the projects I've worked on, I've stayed with them throughout that period. It's too many projects, unfortunately, just become coffee table books that sit on the coffee table, or become a report that sits on a shelf and gathers dust, and nobody picks them up or reads them. And then there's that issue of political will. If you haven't got, if you like, a political champion who's prepared to drive that thing. And that's, again, I think a telling point for the Lanseria Smart City. It sits at a crossroads now of, has it got a champion? Yeah. There was a great champion, Jack Kossoff, who sat in the Premier's office, and he's kind of straddled the Premier and the presidency. And he was seriously great. He was, I suppose, a career official, but had worked in London, worked in New York. He seriously knew his way around the public dimension of city building. He was a great asset, but and of course, luckily, he's gone to a great project, but it's not the Lanseria Smart City anymore. So he's now, as I understand it, he's with Sasol on the green hydrogen project. But he was a serious piece of work, that guy. And I've got to say, I haven't found somebody who's supplanted that and can be that champion who drives it. The guy who was the Dave Jack of the Victorian Alfred Waterfront, So you need that political buy-in, you need the policy support, and you need the courage of people who are prepared to back something. Yeah. Which, of course, we had with the Sandton Square project back in the day. Sandton was a small little local authority in its own right, and they had a management committee that was prepared to back the thing, and they pushed it very hard. That's why it was successful. Yeah. You can't just pay lip service to things. You can't just pose. It's hard work.
With everything you just said, right, with Sandton, the VNA, and Lanseria, you mentioned a great deal about the leaders who were doing that project. And you also said you were able to lead the Lanseria project during COVID without meeting people, and it was a success. So what I'm asking is that, what do you think makes a great leader?
Oi. They come in every shape, form, and size, I think. And let me say this too, is that I don't think you can ever talk about the leader without first saying what are the component parts of the team and who are those people in the team. And that Lanseria project just had wonderful people at every level in that team. And they were go-to people. They were people I trusted entirely, and even not having met some of them, it very quickly became apparent where their capacities were and what their strengths were and what you could work to. But one of the most important things in that too, because it was working under this thing of a virtual platform, was we had an extraordinary person who was running the stakeholder engagement program, a guy called Julian Drew of NMA. He was remorseless in his communication, of keeping people in touch with everything, of assembling meetings, of creating one-on-ones, of all of that. He was, so I cite him simply as how important that was because of the COVID thing. So we did it in spite of COVID, and what we did was largely due to his extraordinary effort. What we had to do to use his platform was also extraordinary, but he created that platform that was amazing. So to go back to your question, I can't speak about, there are so many different kinds of leaders. I can only talk about what I suppose my style would be. And I've never really regarded myself as a leader, but it's always, I've found myself in that position. And I think it would be, in my case, it's got to be inclusionary, it's got to be inclusive. But it equally cannot be chat shows and just setting up committees and hoping that a committee is going to get us through this thing. And you've got to be prepared to distill criticalities out of all of these deliberations and all the communication you have that you engage with broadly. And then you've got to say, we're taking these handful of principles and we're forming these as the cornerstones of an approach. And then, of course, as you move in on those cornerstones and you start to consolidate on those cornerstones, there are many, many other issues that you now have to start working on. And you do the same. And it's a very iterative process. And I think this thing that I would say is, if you like, in my style, is you never push a car through a gate and then close the gate behind it and say you're not coming back. Because then the car's going to be standing there saying, now should I go or not? Because there's still a little patch of green there that I haven't got to. There's still a, if it's a bull, there's still a little cow back there that I want to get to, If you're going to close me out and make me move on, I don't know what I'm going into, etc. It's not like that. I don't think life's like that, but a project cycle shouldn't be like that as well. And the best person I ever had was a director of what was then the great Tongaat Hewlett's team that yielded the Umhlanga Ridge Town Centre, etc. And he never closed the gate behind us. We always had the sense we could come back and explore and go back forward again. It wasn't a linear process. It was cyclic, it was iterative, it was back and forth. In a sense, I can only it's almost like a vortex of energy that moves like a hurricane, But it's always got a very set, focused point. But there's this mayhem up there. But what you're doing is you're taking what in the early stages of things are vast, imponderable things, and you're slowly distilling them down into something more and more focused. But you're also never saying, and that I think is a hallmark of the work that GAPP and myself have been worked in all our lives. We never talk about a master plan. We think a master plan is a totally alien way of thinking in an African context, and particularly in South Africa, where you've got a relatively small economy. It's a stop-start economy. It's an economy heavily influenced by political overlays, all sorts of things. And, of course, not just political overlays, but then lobby groups that can also wield a lot of power in it. It's very difficult. And, of course, in a small economy, you can't do things programmatically. You can't say, okay, we're going to design a city, so we're going to put the opera house here, and we're going to put the art gallery there, and the library will go there. Sometimes those projects don't cross your desk for hundreds of years. So if you look at the V&A, there were people talking about an aquarium and said, well, where's the aquarium going to come from? But I'll tell you what, if there is going to be an aquarium, this is where we'll put it. And in many respects, what we call a framework, a development framework, is like a mental construct of how you're going to plug and play stuff as you find it. You'll take whatever you can get and put it in place when you can. Okay? And the thing becomes far more open-ended. You're not trying to take a children's coloring book drawing and now build it on the ground. This thing takes a life of its own, because even in those quick economies, like the States, like Dubai, etc., even though they're building the master plan very quickly, time and events are already overtaking them by the time they get into the end of that. Whereas if you're working in this process way, and the thing, that's another thing I would say about the property industry, it shouldn't be regarded as products, it's actually a process. And so always what I speak about is stimulus response mechanisms. What you're actually doing is, as you do something, you're not reaching down to a focused point of something finished. You're actually unleashing a myriad opportunities of stuff that hasn't even been thought of yet. And that's a fascinating thing. And so a lot of what I do is sit on the design review panel that actually implements these things. And that's not just that saying, oh, have you got this, have you done that, tick, tick, tick. It's actually, that's where the city gets assembled. Because I'm sitting there in design review, I know what a developer there's doing, I know what one there's doing, and I know the guy sitting in front of me now is doing this. And I say, hey, look at, I hadn't thought of that. If you could put some of this into that and that into there, you've created a souffle suddenly, instead of just these individual little ingredients sitting in piles. You've created this whole thing, you know, and that's probably the thing that gives me most satisfaction nowadays, I suppose, is that thing of design review and the collective thing of meeting fantastic architects and planners and all sorts of other people and developers, and you're all putting the stuff on the table in a totally non-threatening kind of way. And you've just got to gently coax people around and until you all find the commonalities of things in the sweet spot. So that's the management, or let's call it the leadership style I would talk about, I think. But there are people who do the same thing in very kragtadig ways. And I just say, it's my way or the highway, you know, and it's not, I suppose, just personality based.
But do you think that works in terms of being specifically being a leader? You
know, there was a guy, I'm sure you'll remember, his name was Sol Kersner, and he built these things. He was like that. Like, that's how it's happening, guys. You know, like, you know, no challenge, no. There's, you know, that thing of nothing clears the mind like an absence of options. This is what we do, you know, and that's it. It's just not my style, and I don't think it works for projects. It doesn't make for cities. Sol couldn't build a city, I think, even though it's called Sun City. He couldn't really build an authentic city because you can't do it in that sort of heavy-handed, I suppose, because it's about self-interest. You know, a project should be self-serving and self-interested because that's why you're doing it. Okay. What I'm doing is to find out how can that thing, with another self-serving thing, how can you take 2 and 2 and make much, much more than 4? That's what cities are. And that's the space I'm in. And that's what the public environment is.
So throughout your career, who was the worst, most difficult person, who was the hardest to work with?
Yeah, it didn't work for Sol ever. I think on the face of what I've seen and heard, he would probably have been your kind of, you know, a cocktail made in hell for people like me. But I think it's not a person that I would finger. I think it's people who close their minds are the hardest people to work for. I had some fantastic older partners in our practice, many of whom are now sadly passed on to the great architect in the sky, but others still around. But I've always had extraordinary thinkers around me, and that was really great. And one guy in particular, Glenn Gallagher, was extraordinary. And he had such a flaky memory. He sometimes battled to remember his wife's name to introduce him. You know, he was like a nutty professor in a way. But he had an incredible eye for architecture, for cities and city space and things like that. But he once said to me, he said, you know, I think architecture is giving people precisely what they want in ways they never dreamed imaginable. He said, otherwise, if you knew precisely what you want, you could have just gone to a draftsman and say, draw me precisely that, and then that's what you're going to get. The job of the architect is to find out precisely what someone wants and then give them that thing that they just never could have imagined. But it's meeting every one of those needs. Okay? And effectively saying, you've got to look at what they like till your eyes bleed. You've got to listen till your ears bleed. You've got to so wrap yourself up in their world in order to give them much more than that, right? So that's what became and still remains, I suppose, my working definition of architecture. Years later, when I reminded Glenn of that, he said, did I say that? I don't remember that. Okay, that's what I loved about Glenn. He's like, he just gave ideas with magnanimity. And I suppose it's what I've never been overly good at it because I'm probably too opinionated. But so was Glenn in many ways. But I am hoping that there's something more I can give back now through just mentorship or whatever you want to call it, and just talking through things. But if I think of going back to your question of the difficult people to work with, it's the people who are trying to they're trying to create the problem, they're redefining the problem to suit the solution they've already got in mind. I'll tell you what, too much of that happens in architecture, I think. That they are people who want to build this extraordinary thing on your budget for themselves. And in all of that, they totally lose sight of the fact that this thing has to work for them. It's their money, it's their dream, it's their vision, it's their need. And if you can't get in touch with that, then I think you're doing that thing of closing your mind and just trying to defend your own iconic, I suppose, your ego in a way. And I think having opinions is very different from being egotistical. I'm here to have opinions because people pay me for my opinions and things. And I hope my opinions, if they don't have immediate worth, they've got at least some addition to the discussion. But that doesn't mean that it's just because I'm ego. Of course, I've got a huge ego as well, and many of us do. But it's not because of that. And cities don't allow egos to last very long. They'll let the odd piece happen here and there, but largely, and again, quite often, those ego things get readopted. The Ponte Vecchio in Florence is one of the greatest examples of how a private environment becomes a public environment. The Medici family of Florence, who not only invented banking, they invented compound interest. Effectively, they created the modern economy, okay? And they had their palace on one side of the River Arno that goes through Florence, and their bank sat on the other side. So kind of like their palace and their bank. And the Arno River didn't have that many crossings of bridges. So they set out to build their own bridge right across that would link directly from their palace to there. And not only that, to give them the most direct route to work, so to speak, they also made it a sheltered, covered bridge so that they didn't have to go in the rain and the sleet and the mud and blah, blah, blah. So they build this thing. And of course, wherever because the cities always form either at a port or where a river gets crossed by a bridge or where two crossroads happen, there's always a genus of what starts a city, because what's going to happen is you're going to take your tomato box and put it there and start selling stuff. That's what economies are, okay? So cities are driven around these very physical principles from nothing to extraordinary, okay? And so the Medicis did everything they needed, but what the city got was another river crossing. And so, of course, all the traffic in the world starts moving across this bridge. It's not long before people say, I'll take my tomato box and put it here now, and I'll sell to people going across the bridge, okay? And so that's what they did. And then every night they'd have to take their stuff back to wherever it was, whether they lived in a sewer pipe or wherever. And then after a while they start saying, well, why do I have to carry my goods back and forward? Why don't I just build a makeshift kind of a container here? And then I can go, but I'll leave my goods. Then after a while he says, well, why do I have to leave? Well, I've got my goods here. I've got nowhere to go. So I'll fashion a little. And the next thing is this whole bridge gets inhabited with buildings, with effectively shacks. And it becomes historically what is probably the greatest shopping center in the world, and all because of people. That's one of the greatest things of stimulus response. And of course, very often it's totally unimagined and it's unintended consequence. But that's also a great part of what we do, because so we get to this maybe, and should I make this the final thing I would have to speak about, because otherwise I could go on forever. I think we get city management all wrong. And worldwide, I would think, but there are cities around the world who do it a lot better, and some of them hugely better. But I think the South African system, which comes out of the old British kind of public administration system, really, with overlays of the Dutch stuff, etc. But it's about, we send kids to university and we tell them, you better know what you're doing, okay? And just in case you have forgotten, because I'm sure you know, Ashby's law of requisite variety, in a nutshell, is if one system wants to control another system, the controlling system has to be at least as complex, if not more complex, than the system it's trying to control. Okay? So what does that say about cities? We're going to take the thing that most closely approximates human biology. Vastly complex. It's just like mind-blowingly complex. It's actually far easier to send a rocket to the moon, because you cut out all the extraneous variables. You just focus on, and there's nothing, everything else is what you know, and you work only within that known world. And there are no extraneous variables that can get in the way of the thing. Cities are just, there are extraneous variables at every turn, every single second of the day. And so how do you manage something that complex? How do you create a management agency that's more complex than that? And you're going to do it in that pathetic way. So, well, we've got a mayor, and then we've got a mayoral committee, and then there's a management committee, and then we've got all these entities. And all you've done is you've drawn one of these pathetic organograms that has about the complexity of chewing gum. It doesn't mimic complexity at all. So what they do is they say, all right, well, and they don't do this they've never heard of Ashby's law of requisite variety, I suppose. What they do, they know they can't manage the city as it is. And so the stuff they can't manage, they regard as aberration and wrong. And so what they do is they paint a children's coloring book of what they think the city should be. And it'll always be yellow, where you're going to have single detached houses, and it'll be orange, where you're going to have higher density houses. Industrial will always be purple, open space will always be green, and red will always be the business stuff, okay? And so you make this children's coloring book, and that becomes the city, because, man, we can control that. And so all you're doing is you're taking a dumbed down version of the city, pretending that's the city, and then that's what you pretend you're managing. And, well, in fact, you're more than managing it, you're controlling it. It's actually called development control, okay? And we send kids off to university and say, now you better learn how to control these things, You might as well say, Jesus, no pressure, guys, but it's not fair to do that to a kid, because they can't know these things, because none of us can know these things. And the truth of the matter is, what we should be doing is getting into management of identifying what is happening whether it's at a large scale or a small scale. What's happening in the city here? What are the processes driving it? What are the economics behind it? What are the social and cultural things that influence this? And when you know what those things are, how do you start managing that process towards something that is more cohesive, consolidated? How do you actually see things? Guys, with the best will in the world, it might be organic, but this is bad and it's going to kill us on something or another. For example, pumping industrial effluent into sewers that go into rivers. Okay, you can't do that. So we know that stuff. We don't allow that to happen. But so there are, of course, things you do need to take seriously under control. But there are other things that you just got to manage and say, what could this become? What is it naturally wanting to move towards? And that's where I look for most of my understanding of where I start out. And it always, funnily enough, happens on the, not in my case because I don't smoke, but it'll happen on the back of a cigarette box. Or very importantly, it'll be on one of those sick bags in an aeroplane when you're flying back from your first site visit. And I like the new ones that you get now because they haven't got advertising on them. So you've got a lot more drawing space on a sick bag now in an aeroplane. But those ideas, those diagrams are very, very powerful origins of things. And then that becomes, so it's never this thing, you know, so much of our world is about we daren't draw anything until we first have workshopped, and then everything just devolves into a talk show and nothing happens. And that's, of course, what too much city politics is just about that as well. It's just about setting up committees and talking, but never actually moving to something, you know. Whereas I'm perfectly comfortable with this idea of saying, guys, you've called me in to have some thoughts on this. Those are my thoughts. They're on the sick bag, but those are the earliest ideas that you'll find. And I want to test those ideas with you. I'm not saying, tell me what you'd like, and then I'll think of something. And like, I'm being called in to do something a lot more than that. So I suppose it is a kind of a leadership thing. But we kind of, I think quite often a lot of people don't know what to do, so they do talk shop it. But I think we're better off when somebody stands up and is brave enough to take a bit of a lead, but they must never be able to ride roughshod over people.
I see what you mean. When you talk about control and systems managing other systems, it makes me wonder, because a lot of people are saying this whole sustainability thing and going green and global warming, these things are a hoax. It's just a form of way to control people. The reason we're going from petrol cars to electric cars because electric cars can be controlled and whatnot. So where do you stand in terms of sustainability?
Yeah. Okay, so I suppose we might, all of us, even you many years later, I hope, will go to our graves wondering about one of the biggest wonders I have at the moment. How did this extraordinary freedom we now have in the information age, that is unprecedented throughout history, and of course throughout history we've always seen in a sense, the war between establishment and new frontiers of what has been science or knowledge or whatever, okay? We've always seen that dichotomy and that antagonism, which led to the Inquisitions and all kinds of stuff, you know? And of course, not that long ago, a president of the United States, being Bush in that case, actually put in a moratorium on stem cell research because it's frightening. Because no one understands it except the people who are doing the research, right? So do you think all those scientists went home and said, oh dear, we can't do this anymore, so we won't? They just actually stopped communicating with the world and they said, bugger you, we're just going. And that's what happens when you keep trying to hold things back. And so we've always seen that tension throughout history. And now suddenly, in the last 30 years, we've exploded into the biggest freedom we've ever had, which is freedom of information and access to information, and pretty much across the world. You know, it's not, and in many ways it's transcended the digital divide thing as well. We have access to information at levels that is absolutely extraordinary. What did we choose to do with it? I choose to just say, geez, we're living in the most amazing world of uncertainty. The whole Western thing has run its course. There's now a world of people, of cultures, of all sorts of things, all of whom can do extraordinary things and are doing extraordinary things. And we are living in a world of extraordinary possibility. And yet a whole bunch of us choose to start looking at conspiracy theories and stuff that totally holds us back. And using the access to information to, in fact, then flood all kinds of fake news and stuff onto that same platform. You know, it just and more people who feel frightened by uncertainty, because it is the most basic natural thing, I suppose, for humans to be terrified about uncertainty. Trouble is, uncertainty is the real dynamic of the world. It's not knowing stuff. It's not knowing stuff is the real dynamic. And that's what makes us so extraordinary as humans. Because we're so dumb in so many other ways, you know. But that our ability to redesign, to keep thinking, to keep inventing ourselves with knowledge is extraordinary. But now we're actually terrified of change, we're terrified of uncertainty, and so we hold it back. And and I'm giving you my candid views of this kind of world that we're in, and in saying so, I'm dissing conspiracy theory and I'm dissing a lot of stuff, okay? And I think it's important that we say these things. And what if I'm wrong? I might be wrong, but I don't think so. I just know that it's been a human thing throughout history, and I see that in cities particularly, how we try and hold on to constancy rather than embracing change. Okay? So in the South African context, what we should have been looking at, and in my view haven't done enough of, is not to say, how do I go to bed at night praying that tomorrow stays the way it was today? Meaning, how do things not change? I'm far more fascinated with this idea of going to bed and praying, how do we make tomorrow better than it was yesterday? Okay. And I think that's the kind of standoff. And of course, it's very quickly going to be a standoff between people, not whether they have a lot, but they've got, in a sense, a feeling of certainty. And they just can't cope with this other world of uncertainty. And so they try and hold stuff. And I think that's at the root of the conspiracy stuff. The global warming, you know, it's insane that we're even still talking about that. Yeah. And the urgency of it, it's insane that we think we've got time to have this talk. It's terrifying. And it's not terrifying for the planet. You know, all the people who think they're saving the planet, they're not. The planet has gone through, if you've gone to the Marapeng cradle of humankind, just there you'll see there've been at least 5 or 6 mass extinctions that are known through that extraordinary time period, not talking about history, not even prehistory. It's like what we know of the world's history. There have been at least 5 or 6 mass extinctions. I would hazard a guess that humanity is going to do exactly the same. And when we do something finally very stupid and literally go poof and disappear, and life as we know it on the world ends, I think the planet will shrug a mighty sigh of relief that we've gone. And ice ages will come, and darkness will come, all kinds of stuff will come and go, and a new kind of little microbe will crawl out from under a rock or from out of the river or from a swamp or the sea, whatever, and a new life form will go on. The planet carries on living. The question is, do we carry on living? And if you want to be playing Russian roulette, then please be my guest and start saying, oh, well, you know, the global warming thing is all just like a big conspiracy. Yeah.
Well, on the same breath of that topic, are you aware of the Venus Project?
No.
Okay. So, the Venus Project is just a whole nother can of worms where the world, cities are made in a circular form where everything just rotates. But that's a topic for another day. We just want to know, for you to be where you're at, what would you advise, like for our viewers who like reading, what would be your top 3 best books to look at?
I would immediately start with a person who wasn't an urbanist, but was probably one of the most acute observers of the city. And that person is Jane Jacobs. She was a journalist. She's long since joined the choir Invisible, but she back in 1964 wrote a book called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And I've always thought that anybody who honestly has the city at heart and wants to be a councillor and get involved in that city's life, they should have to read that as prescribed reading. Because it's so, she was an activist, so from a journalistic background and just an observer, and she wrote many other books on cities as well. But for me, The Death and Life of Great American Cities is the most fundamental one that I would recommend to anybody, just to get a sense and a take on the city. I would refer not necessarily to the whole book, but to portions of Jacob Bronowski's book on the ascent of man that I spoke of. And of course, that was written at a time when you said man rather than humanity. It's not gender sensitive, but that's the name of the book. I can't help that. Okay, it was still a great book. And so those would be 2 that come to mind very quickly. The ones that influenced me from an urban design point of view, in fact, and it's probably silly to even put them out there as references because they're journal articles rather than books. Okay. But you might, of course, this extraordinary internet that we have, you'll look at that up, you'll find those journal articles. But there was a guy at Penn University, Dave Crane, who I regard as, in a sense, the father of modern urban design as a discipline and a great thinker around cities. And he never wrote a book as far as I know, but he wrote journal articles, quite short articles, very accessible. But the one that all of them were profound for me and that I still abide by them, so to speak, they're my touchstones. But one in particular was called Capital Web and the City of 1,000 Designers. And why I say that is because it unpacks much of what I've been saying about the capital web is that enablement of the public environment. It doesn't only have to be a public environment, but it's very predominantly the public environment. You put that in as the enablement of the response by private developers. And those private developers and their teams of architects and engineers and everything else are the real people who design the city. And he says the 1,000 designers, there in fact are millions of the designers. But that's what I love. I love cities of 1,000 designers, not cities that are the work of one big mind trying to build like Lego. So Dave Crane, Capital Web and the City of 1,000 Designers, I would reference. And then the 4th book, you only asked for 3, but I'll give you a 4th. And again, these are, you can see I'm an old bully because these are all old kind of references, but they were seminal, and remain seminal. They're as valid today as ever. And that is a guy called Jonathan Barnett, who was an urban designer who worked in public administration in New York City. And he wrote a book called Urban Design as Public Policy. And inherent in that is this idea of 2 things. One is we've got to go so far beyond what town planning deals with in terms of zoning and this making of children's diagrams, to this understanding of what is the city in its 3 dimensions and in all its multiplicities, in how urban economics work, how urban sociology works, how traffic moves, how goods come and go, understanding all of that. And how do you code that into public policy and effectively guide the design of the city? You're not designing the city, but you're guiding the city through these codes in a way. And he was extraordinary. That was an exemplary book. And the most important thing, and I suppose it goes back to our 9 months of being online in that thing, he said, urban design is about being there when fundamental decisions are being made. So meaning just get involved in the forums and find out what's distilling out of them and pull them together and find something congruent in all of that and find something where you get to that famous thing I say of 2 and 2 so much more than 4, which is the 101's definition of synergy. And that's what Jonathan Barnett did extraordinarily, or offered through the discipline of urban design. This thing of being there when critical decisions are being made. And it doesn't mean you can physically be there, but you've got to be aware of what these things are so you can distill them.
Wow, with that being said, we can go on for a long time, but because of time, we just wanted to know in closing, since you've retired from GAPP and now you choose which projects you want.
I'm working harder than ever.
Yes. But you have a spark on your face when you talk about retiring and picking your projects. So in closing, how do you feel right now?
If I was to, and I don't think it's an overstatement, I'm having the halcyon days of my career right now. This is the best part of my career.
What makes it the best part?
It's a bunch of things, and they're things that have actually totally humbled me. Extraordinarily, I thought that when I retired, particularly from a big practice, that I would quite quickly sort of just end up on the scrap heap, just as another retired person kind of thing, or what the market assumed to be retired. Quite the converse. I found people really want to hear what I'm saying, and that surprises me. It really does, because I've seen so many people where, in a sense, they do lose relevance. I've suddenly found a new relevance in what I'm doing, and as I say, I've made a point of not working on risk, other than when I think it can build to something much bigger and not just a project, but build a whole new understanding of something. I will take on some of that stuff just by putting my energy into it for the time being and see where it goes. But apart from that, I don't work on risk. And weirdly, and let me tell you, in this property industry, there is nothing worse than the abuse of architects and urban designers and planners who are expected to work on risk, and engineers and stuff as well. With what I've got to say is not a great payback. You're working on risk and not a great payback. So it's a funny world, and it's indicative of a very inadequate kind of market, I suppose. Anyway, leaving that aside, the fact that I insist on being paid seems to give me more relevance. Because now they're paid, they better well bloody listen. And so I have found that, and I'm not demeaning them. I'm saying the people I'm working with now are really great clients. They're fantastic clients. But I'm humbled, and sometimes, or initially, I'd say in the first year of these 2 years, I was sometimes quite frightened about the responsibility of them listening to me. Because now I'm all on my own. I'm not this practice, not a big machine behind me anymore. And interestingly, although I never realized it at the time, when you spoke to someone as a front of a big organization, you could always imagine, I suppose, they were thinking, yeah, we can see where you're going. You've got to feed this very big family, and so you're trying to fabricate more work out of this, etc. Whereas now, it's just what I'm saying now, what I'm doing now, and committing to. They don't have that sense, I suppose, that I'm doing it for any other reason than I think that's the way we should go. And that's also it's not only humbling, it's a huge responsibility. And so in all this, and finding out that, and then the last dimension of it, I have enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to potentially being more involved through a mentorship program that I'm on the fringes of at the moment, but likely to get more involved with. But I think this idea of mentoring, and I don't mean mentoring in that here's an old grey-haired man trying to tell kids how the world used to work and how it should still work. I'm talking about that mentoring where you find the freshness of young people, and that dialogue becomes such a fantastic thing. That's what I'm enjoying now and looking forward to more, is that working with young people. And for them saying I'm a mentor, but I'm not really. I just enjoy the energy.
Well, Erky, I guess it's because of the work you've done, and we really appreciate you. In closing, we just ask you to just give our viewers one piece of advice. It could be less than a minute. Anything that you think they might need.
No pressure. I suppose maybe as a life lesson from my life, I would say, as much as I think it's important that there are all these self-improvement programs, etc., my sense is that a lot of them are about you're encouraged and instructed to imagine what it is your goal is and what you're aiming for. And you even put pictures of that on your fridge with fridge magnets and things. You make such a total picture that you're moving towards. And I think that's fine, the techniques. And obviously it works for a hell of a lot of people, and I'm not knocking that. All I've found through my life was interesting is that if you're going to imagine something, it's got to come from your imagination. And what if your imagination doesn't allow you to imagine stuff beyond your imagination? So the thing you're going to focus on and make a goal of is actually still entirely within your imaginative realm. My life has been about things that I never imagined and found. And as my older brother is an industrial designer with one of the most fertile minds I've ever come across. But he would always just say, I'm just a puppy dog that wags my tail and chases the ball that bounces closest to me. And I think I'm kind of like that. I let other situations spark my imagination and present an opportunity where I'm obliged to now say, hey, that's interesting. How do I think about that? And what I do with it, etc. And so I respond to that. And that's just my own takeout from my own life. And I don't mean to sound preachy with all of that. It's just a feeling I've always had, or I've come to have because I've looked back on it.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's no further explanations or anything. I presented to you Erky Wood.